Hello and welcome. My name is Anthony Albecker, and I am a proud first-generation college student and TRIO Student Support Services alum. I direct the University of Minnesota's federally funded TRIO McNair Scholars Program, which seeks to diversify the graduate school and PhD pipeline and serve students who are from underserved, underrepresented, and first-generation backgrounds. The University of Minnesota McNair program is celebrating its 30th year this year, and that makes us one of the oldest and longest continuously funded programs in the country. And that is a big deal. And a core ingredient of our success, where so many have not been able to have that track record of success, is the amazing faculty mentors and faculty collaborations from across the university. It's faculty who volunteer their time and expertise serving as McNair mentors and program consultants to these amazing students and the staff. And it is in that perspective that I facilitate this, because I have a unique advantage in not only working with amazing young adults, but I have the opportunity to work with faculty from across departments, across our campus, across our system, and across the country. Now, today's panelists represent a range of disciplines, and a commonality amongst all the panelists is their strong classroom teaching, it's their academic engagement, and they are all phenomenal partners in helping identify, recruit, mentor, and support first-generation students in a holistic way. And I am very grateful for these panelists who are working above and beyond to volunteer their time to have this conversation when they are already maxed out and working very hard. And so with that said, I want to be able to hand the floor off to panelist introductions. And so panelists are going to get us started by sharing a little bit about themselves and about a little bit about their academic journey and academic focus. With that said, I hand the floor to Daheia.
Thanks so much, Anthony, and thank everyone for being here, my fellow panelists, and of course, Rashmi for having the vision of creating this conference, this gathering of important discussions around first-generation college students. I'm Dr. Daheia Barr-Anderson, an associate professor in the School of Kinesiology, and just like Anthony, I'm a very proud first-generation student. But I like to think of myself more so as a first opportunity, because my parents are way smarter than I am, and they would have excelled in a college setting, but they just didn't have the opportunity. And so I was one of the first to be able to pursue my dreams in such a way. And so as a School of Kinesiology professor, I come way from South Carolina, born and bred South Carolinian, biology undergrad major, went on to get my master's in epidemiology and my PhD in kinesiology. And within the School of Kinesiology now, my research focuses on increasing physical activity and addressing obesity prevention and treatment in mainly children, but also I have created a line of interest of focusing on adults. I am particularly interested in working with African-American and Black families. I have two lines of research, one that is very family focused and the other one which really captures one of my passions, yoga. And so I have conducted some research around yoga. I have been very fortunate to be a McNair Scholar Advisor a couple of times, and I will be a mentor this summer for MS ROP students. So not the same as McNair, but very parallel goals. I welcome the opportunity to have this discussion, and so I will hand it over to Zha so that he can introduce himself. Thank you all.
Hello, everyone. And first of all, thank you, Anthony, for coordinating and inviting me to be part of this wonderful panel. My journey to higher ed is a little different. So I'm actually a associate professor in the Department of Family and Social Science, as you could see in this slide. But let me just tell you a little bit about that journey, and then I'll talk a little bit about my work. I came to America when I was 14 without any English as a refugee. Started in the 9th grade. I think ESL was sort of my savior, because every day I don't know what I would actually do without that ESL teacher. So I want to say ditto to all the ESL teachers out there. You actually made a huge difference, and at least for me. I'm actually repeated the 9th and 10th grade in order for me to go to college because of English. When I went to college, I had no idea what I was doing. I did not have a lot of mentors. At the time, it was Mansfield University, so we didn't have a lot of resources. I struggled through. Major in psychology, even though my dad wanted me to become a businessman. Disappointed my dad, decided to become a psychologist or clinical psychologist. When I first got my job out of college, I was working as a Minnesota Extension Service, working with refugee youth, and that's how I developed an interest in looking at youth and parenting. And so I went back into graduate school in Family Social Science, which is the Department of Family Social Science at the University of Minnesota. Finished my master's and PhD, went away for a couple of years and then came back to the University of Minnesota in 2002. And I've done a lot of work on Southeast Asian refugees, parenting, Southeast Asian refugee families. At the moment, I was very interested in looking at child development, child adjustment in the context of the interaction between family, school, and community. So I'm actually have a longitudinal study with several charter schools in Minnesota.
Thank you. And I'm Yaniv Brandvain. Thanks all for having me. I am not a first generation student. My parents both went to college, but as I entered college, I really thought of college as a technical training for a future career and didn't recognize it was also potentially an exciting intellectual journey where you grow and think deeply. And so that was a big change, and then as I started to think about future studies, it was somewhat a fish out of water while thinking about graduate, because I went to a small college, graduate programs and other training, but I found a deep interest in evolution in genetics, which I've been studying, got my PhD in. A transformational moment here was the past 5 or 6 years I've been teaching a statistics class, and I really find it quite interesting and fun. I find it to be a really great subject, but I also find it to be quite challenging for students and quite technical. And I was trying to figure out how to teach those technical topics equitably to, students that might have different amounts of time to work on their homework and different background coming in. And so that's been a big challenge where I've thought deeply about how to teach in a way that can serve the entire school instead of people privileged enough to have more time and energy. Yeah, I've worked with numerous students through the MSRAP, the Trio McNair program, and the North Star STEM Alliance, and I found that to be, quite fun and a great place to get motivated students and show them that they can, go on their own intellectual journey as part of college.
Hi, my name is Casey Harrison, and my parents were the first in their families to go to college. They were part of that post-war generation of white folks who benefited from federal policies and were able to make that class leap from working class to solidly middle class, in large part through education. And so they were both scientists. And so I grew up kind of being acclimated to the language of higher ed, hearing about tenure and research, and saw it really as my job to assimilate to the elite norms of the institutions that I attended as I pursued my undergrad and then my PhD in English literature. And so as I became a teacher and as I developed more of a social justice lens, it really became my work to unlearn many of those assumptions and to figure out how to demystify that academic world that I had been pretty comfortable in. So I was lucky when I joined PSTL in 2010 to be surrounded by colleagues, many of whom had their roots in the general college and who really helped me understand the requirements of teaching, which had really been neglected in my graduate education. And so I'm grateful to folks like Rashni and others in PSTL who really transformed the way that I approached my subject and pedagogy. And now I teach in the Youth Studies program, I teach Youth Global Perspectives, and I also teach in the first year inquiry program in the College of Ed.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Vianne. I did my doctorate in counseling psychology over on the Twin Cities campus down the road. Now I'm over in Duluth in the psychology department. Well, in terms of my journey to higher education, I would say that I'm a first generation traditional college student, yet I want to honor my parents' journey as well. So I would say probably 1.5. So they both came over to the States as refugees. My dad is a war veteran from the South Vietnam Navy. And my dad took much longer than 4 years for his degree through community college and then university, finishing in his 30s. And my mother earned her bachelor's when I was in high school. So that was an achievement at the time that was actually very underrated in my family. And I didn't really understand the importance of college. Like, we didn't even attend her graduation, which now looking back, it was, yeah, a little sad. But I remember in 7th grade when I was taking a high school level math course and not doing so well because I didn't, just something I tested into. And I was on the border of a C+ and B. And my teacher was like, you need to get at least a B in this course because this is going to go on your high school transcript and it's going to impact you getting into college. And I remember being like, I don't even know what that really means. Why do I care? So, but she was very kind, and for extra credit, I cleaned her whiteboards and she gave me a B. And now looking back on that, it's like, thank you, Mrs. Lucia, for making sure I didn't apply to college with any C's on my transcript, because I didn't even, like, back then, it was like, what is that? And I'm also very appreciative of a mentor that I had in high school who I wouldn't even had applied to Johns Hopkins if it weren't for him. So that's something that I hold in value as well. And that also drives me in terms of serving as a mentor.
Well, thank you all. So what will be happening right now is we've got some guiding questions to get us going. And so Jessica's going to start to populate them as we get to the questions. And so that first question is going to be, what are ways that you approach teaching that seeks to unpack hidden curriculum, especially for first generation students? And it's going to be at this point that I'm going to stop my screen share so we can see each other more fully.
All right, so I had volunteered in our planning to get us started on this one. So first of all, one thing I like to do is really bring a critical lens to how we got where we are and what the university is. So in my first year inquiry classes, this year we started out by reading the article Land Grab Universities that has gotten a lot of attention. It was published in High Country News, and it's a study of the wealth transfer from indigenous lands to land grant institutions that were part of the Morrill Act. And so bringing that critical lens and kind of deconstructing what a university is as a start of a larger process in the class of using that critical lens. And at later points in the semester, I bring in the TPT documentaries about the Morrill Hall uprisings that established the ethnic studies programs at the school, and the building renaming debates that we're still currently in the middle of. And but then in terms of just working with students on assignments, really scaffolding the research process, and so that we can focus on little bits at a time, and not assuming that they already have the skills that we're expecting them to demonstrate. And then as part of that process, I've really appreciated the library resources that are out there. So there's some great videos that our libraries have produced about, understanding the difference between academic and popular sources, or what is peer review, or how do I avoid plagiarism. So it's been really, it's been great realize that I don't have to reinvent the wheel, but that there are so many great resources out there that I can make use of and avail my students of.
Thanks, Casey. I like how you use the word deconstruct. I have like a go-to activity in my assessment course where we deconstruct scale deconstruction, because it's really this question of like, how are we assessing things? And like, if these measures are biased, then what is it that we really know? So that deconstruction part, I think, is as important as we construct and develop new theories or new measures. So with that, I think I am fortunate being in psychology and having like multiculturalism be at the forefront of it, at least in the way that I try to teach my courses. So with that, one way in which I try to like unpack the hidden curriculum is bring forth the idea that we all have diverse identities, marginalized and privileged identities. We all have implicit and explicit biases. And I especially think of that among first generation students, because at times first generation students can hold identities that are, well, marginalized being a first generation student, while not having any salient or clear, obvious identities that are marginalized. So I think by even naming these invisible marginalized identities helps students like include that as part of their vernacular, as part of the conversation. So I'm not sure if I have anything more to add in that regard. So I'll pass it to Daheia.
Yeah, thanks so much, Anne. So for me, I think it's really about like connecting to the students, and first and foremost of making it very clear that they have very similar to what Vianne said, that they have a very distinct perspective that is valued in the space that we're creating in the classroom, and that you should be unapologetic of that perspective and very proud of that perspective. And even in the classroom with all PhD professors and students who may not be first generation or who may have had different advantages, that your perspective is very valued and it contributes to the overall culture that's created within the class. And I work really hard to create like a good culture, a respectful culture within my class spaces. But I'm also a really kind of pragmatic person. And so a lot of what KC said, I really tap into resources, right? I think for a lot of students, you coming into these spaces and you have these preconceived notions of what it's going to be like, and then you get there and some of it is true and some of it is not. And all of it is being taken in from probably a place of feeling slightly overwhelmed, particularly as a first generation student. And so I always encourage students, just take a step back, right? Take a step back, look at what's in front of you, your instructions, what the task list may be, and tap into the tons of resources that's available here at the University of Minnesota, that regardless of how you may feeling or how you see yourself, because the imposter syndrome is really real. And I talk to them also a lot about my own personal experience. So I think that helps them to know that you can get to the other side of these feelings of inadequacy that you sometimes experience. That the university wants you to succeed, right? Like, we are deeply invested in you succeeding, and that we want to do all that we can to get you to that next level in life. And so I really drive home those points when when working with students.
So I want to echo my colleagues, and so I'm not going to repeat all the wonderful things that have been said. I want to add a few more points. As a first generation college student, myself, and also someone who actually working on the admissions, and also getting students to applying for jobs. I think that there's a few things in our curriculum that we don't often teach our students. And I want to emphasize a lot of these small things for my students, especially first generation. Like a lot of our first generation have a lot of family obligations. and they may not have 100% attendance, but they don't often know how to communicate with professors. So those are very important, what I tell students, because when they actually get out of college, they want to apply for graduate school or going to apply for a job, they're going to need a letter of recommendation or reference. And not attending class without having a reason would actually look very bad to them when they're actually asking for help. And so those are very important things for my students, being able to reframe things so that they could actually be able to communicate in such a way that other people could actually relate to. So helping them to reframe their ideas, to me, is very important for our first generation. And then particularly in first generation students, and particularly refugees, for example, we're actually working very hard on our grades, and grades are very important, but we don't often think about what is it about the strength that I have, right? So I need to create an identity. What is it that I'm actually interested in? And what are some of the projects that I could demonstrate that these are the things that I'm actually doing that evolve around my interests? And so in my classes, I always trying to engaging in projects where students would have opportunity to do either program review or doing lit review, things that they could actually show to graduate school or to the potential prospective employers, the things that they would actually put in the portfolio. And so those, I think, is very important besides the contents I'm actually teaching. And so to me, it's those the hidden curriculum, the manners in which that they're actually talking to people, right? It's also very important. How do you communicate in via email with professors? You can't email your professor just like your sibling. So those are things that I think is very important, and I don't think we have been taught in my education, and I have to learn from the hard way through my work with trial and error. And I just think that it's very important for my students to get it before they actually get out there and not having to repeat my mistakes. So those are very important component for me as working with this population.
Thanks. Then really quickly, and I have a few small questions. I feel, I'm excited to learn from everyone on this panel. There's one thing I've transitioned to in my teaching in the past few years, which I've really thought was good, is I've tried to reward or be sufficiently positive about students asking very basic questions to make sure they're on board, instead of being like, oh, I have to answer this question you should have heard. And valuing that above and beyond people asking advanced technical questions or answering questions in the class. And I think that's nice because I think it helps the whole class. And so I try to convince students that makes their contributions uniquely valuable, and hopes to make it a safe space to, ask questions and try to learn things and not feel dumb, as I sometimes teach a more technical topic. And so I've been trying to heap lots of praise and reward on the students that ask the more foundational questions to make it feel okay. With the hidden curriculum, I think I've done this poorly, so I'm curious if anyone on the panel can help, where I've been kind of like, just ignoring it and been quite informal and helpful to my students, and not, worrying so much about the traditions and cultural obligations in the field. And I can't tell if that's like friendly and nice, or if that's a terrible idea, because they're going to go out to the real world with different professors and have different experiences. So I appreciate what Zha said about he tries to socialize people appropriately, and I don't know what the right thing is. I've been struggling with that as I've been thinking about how to handle teaching the best.
I think, Yaniv, your question kind of relates to a question that's coming down the line about socialization and mentorship. But I'll just jump in briefly and say that I think it's both and, capitalizing on the ability that students already have to code switch, which many of our first gen students already do. And then, thinking about, how do I teach you about the different strategies that you're going to need to use that are context dependent?
Yeah, and I noticed Rashni's comment about socialization in higher education as a whole. And and coming from us teaching, mentoring our students to the language of the field, while recognizing that that'll be different from how they might communicate with others. And at the same time, we also want to recognize that that was likely for, I mean, I guess it depends, not our vernacular growing up. So also meeting the student where they're at, which is really where we kind of innately are too, because it's these systems that are telling us to speak a certain way or act a certain way or behave a certain way, which might not be congruent with our everyday interpersonal relationships. And especially in psychology, if we're trying to understand humans and human behavior, we want to be congruent with that. So I think that's an excellent point. Thanks for sharing that.
I have a quick response to the Jessica Thompson's question here in the chat. Other people might have different ideas, but I've been thinking about this quite a lot in the past few years about how we maintain or strike the balance between meeting students where they are and maintaining academic rigor. And the thing I've been thinking about is trying to keep rigor where it is, but think about what are the things that I teach in the class because they're like, what gets in the way of student learning, but is extra learning that they need to do, and what are the essential concepts? And I've been trying to, whenever I, have some goal of teaching something, I've been trying to get closer and closer to having the students deal with the most essential concepts. I do like lots of programming and stuff, and trying to figure out, where they can skip, where some of that stuff isn't essential. It might be some ritual that we put them through, but might not be essential to learning. And I found that is a good way both to teach better and to meet students where they are, is to say we're gonna, keep our work rigorous, and by that we're gonna focus on the things that are truly relevant to the class, and try to, often when I have these assignments that have some sort of side thing, try to, focus pretty strictly on, is this really getting to class goal? What are my learning objectives, or is this some sort of distraction, something you have to be able to do to get what I want to do?
I'm also really appreciating what I'm seeing in the chat, and just want to encourage our participants to unmute yourselves and feel free to also jump into the conversation with your voice if that's comfortable.
I do want to jump in, but I'm trying to hold myself back. I was just thinking of all the words you all used in the front end of this. Daheia talked about this notion of first opportunity, which I just loved. It just spoke to my heart. And then unlearning, deconstructing, all of these seem to align with this question of what is academic rigor relative to who is somebody and what is their personhood, right? And is there space for us to recognize that people bring certain types of capital to the academy that maybe isn't valued in the academic space, but then also at the same time recognizing, yeah, there's some things I don't know. I don't know what APA is. Why would I? But I can understand it if you give me the tools of how to get there. It feels like so much of the rub is around these assumptions of what students should know, and particularly the further they get in their majors, that there's a certain language, and then if we unpacked these things more intentionally, it's a form of universal design. Many people would benefit, not just first generation college students, or many students would also be like, yeah, I didn't know that either. So it sort of feels like this really interesting intersection of, even for ourselves, to be like appropriately rigorous, or like be a good representative of what a faculty member is. Do we also in our own trajectories and journeys feel like we have to present in a certain way, versus being like, yeah, I didn't know that either, or this was my journey and identity, and what happens when we do that? What kind of world does that, open up? Just as many of you have done this morning, it's just so powerful. All right,
I have a comment to say based off what you just said, Rashmi. And I guess for me, like even when reading the questions beforehand and thinking about this concept of socialization, that I find somewhat problematic, because of the fact that, particularly as an African-American woman who grew up in the South, and racism is not a new thing to me, and just having to live in it and sit in it so often, I struggle with how much I really want to socialize and have to so it's that grab and that pull and take of holding on to the cultural identity, and that there are some things, right? There's a way of being and some manners that are universal, but there are so many pieces of socialization that is culturally based. And I don't think that like you have to give up, so you can assimilate to what others are saying, especially within academia, because that is like up and out through white supremacy stamped on, academic socialization. And so I think for me is the reason why I focus so much for students on them holding on to who they are and what they have to bring to the table, that even though it's not valued in these spaces, knowing that it's valued, because that's just how life, particularly in this world, in this country, may be for you. And that it's important for you to know, like tapping into those resources and knowing what's expected of you, right? And what's expected of you from like an instructional place, right? There's always these hidden expectations, but that's kind of harder to tap into. And I think that's what, with the question with the hidden curriculum, that students aren't always able to get access to that information, but what you do have access to, instructions, these tasks that you're given for you to tap into the various university, social resources that you have available to you, and you master those to the best of your ability, right? And being able to, just do what you can within these situations.
Yeah, I think so much of the academy often is asking us to give up who we are to be part of it. And I strongly resist that. And I completely agree with you. But it also strikes me that there are ways in which students don't always feel empowered if they haven't had interaction with someone like you or Vian or Casey or, people on this panel who reinforce that it feels like, oh, to be valued here, I have to be like this. Like I have quotes from my data over the years of students literally saying, who I am is not good enough. I have to be this, but I don't want to be this, like recognizing that conflict. So I really appreciate you saying that.
Yeah, and I think that like what you're just saying now is just so important, thinking about how these students are just going to go out into the world, and as much as they can absorb of the importance of their diversity is just so important. Like I am coming from a health sciences background, and so these students are going to go out into clinics and hospitals, and it's so important that they bring this diverse perspective to their jobs. And yeah, I don't know. So I mean, this is exciting. You guys are really great.
Just want to lift up the question in the chat from Jessica Thompson. What strategies have you employed to shift the culture and structure of your disciplines, departments, and academia as a whole to be more culturally inclusive? Because we can do these things in our classrooms, but the question points out that we need to be working on structural change as well. And that piece is really hard. As I mentioned in my intro, at no point in my elite graduate education was there any attention given really to basic principles of teaching, let alone inclusive teaching or critical pedagogies. And I'll just say, to get us started, one really basic thing is curriculum review within your department, making sure that within the materials that you're assigning, you have broad representation from folks who represent that bridging of worlds where they're both fluent and successful in their disciplines, and also are bringing a critical lens and diverse identities and multiple perspectives.
And I want to follow up with that question. I know that I think it's still way to go, but in my department, Family Social Science, we initiated what we call curriculum mapping. And so we would actually go through all the classes, making sure that we actually include a specific pedagogies or things that would actually be very important to address diversity, inclusion, and equity. And if not, how would we actually improve and be changing that course to also address that three component: diversity, inclusion, equity. So it's been a pretty great experience going through courses, but I can tell you that it's very difficult because whoever developed the course are very protective of the course. And so I think it will continue to be part of the conversation But I'm glad that, departments such as mine are actually taking initiative, and I'm sure other departments also taking initiative to ensure that all courses are at least addressing those either one or two of those components in the courses as part of the curriculum.
You're muted, Anthony.
Thank you. This has been an amazing conversation so far, and we're about 11 minutes away from the unfortunate task of having to close this rich dialogue. And so I'm really open right now in terms of how you want to approach this. And so panelists, if there's any one particular question any of you wants to tackle as we kind of triage, or if anybody would like to add a particular question or engage in chat or to speak up, that's where we can pivot right now.
I want to briefly talk about the, I think that maybe Casey talked about this some, but what advice, tips do you have to new educators relating to all these issues? And I would say that I struggled with this as a new educator when I first started here. And because I think we come from, I mean, you have to remember where first of all, that many of us to get into, the academy came from some form of privileged background. So we have all sorts of hidden, on average, hidden knowledge that they might not, and we might have forgotten all the struggles, even, regardless of where we came from, we struggled quite a bit to get there and learned a whole bunch along the way. And I felt like I initially had all these assumptions about, students being like me or coming from a similar place or coming to actually where I was just before I started my teaching here, which is a, very wrong way to approach things. And so I think to take a, before you start teaching your classes or before you start interacting with students, I think to reflect on where you're at, how you got there, and where you think the students are coming from, and think deeply about that, because I think that would have helped me avoid some of my earliest and worst teaching mistakes.
I think that part of this that is like so telling around that is that it shouldn't be happenstance, right? It shouldn't be like a chance that rooted in our own experience or which colleagues we had or whatever, that we are thinking about how we center our teaching, the structure of our curriculum and our pedagogy around inclusivity for what I would like to call the new majority of students who are coming to the academy. And so a part of it, the question that I grapple with a lot is, those of us who are faculty, what becomes our role to forward this with intentionality in our departments, in our programs, in our spaces, because ultimately, the curriculum in the classroom where so much of this happens is in our purview. And where do we find pushback, and how do we speak to that? I'm not saying I know all the answers to it, but it keeps coming back to this in so many different ways and spaces. And so I would welcome, thoughts around that, including the challenges of it, I think.
Yeah, I think the accountability piece is a really tough one. And just thinking about how these concerns need to be part of tenure and promotion. And that, I think, is the biggest hurdle within academic institutions, is shifting that culture. And, as I see, and so that kind of gets back to hiring as well, making sure that the people that we're bringing into the institution are putting these issues front and center. And then as they come into positions of power, that they're also shifting the broader expectations. But it's slow and it's hard.
And yeah, definitely agree with that. And I think too, that culture within the departments and having that translate to how we treat students is really important. Yet within any department or departmental culture, those biases exist, and there are people who might be defensive and not really understand that as we are trying to amplify certain voices, it doesn't mean that we're trying to like soften other people's. So I think it's very complicated and it can be tiring. I'm sure you all can relate since you're all here and in this area. It's tiring trying to be that voice. And sometimes it's just nice to connect with students. So in terms of like takeaways, something that I like to do is have like required office hours as part of a grade for my undergraduate courses. So for courses that are 30 or fewer students, I do that at midterms and at the end of the semester, which can be really tiring, but just like 15 to 20-minute blocks on your calendar, just having that out there, because a lot of students don't even have the self-efficacy to go and talk to a professor. And so I just think that having that there, not having it be optional, like having it be an in-class assignment or requirement in that sense is helpful, because I had that be optional in a 100-person class that I taught. And as you might imagine, not many showed up. So my new plan with that going forward is like grouping students up in their work groups and then having students as a group figure out a time to come to office hours. So that's just one takeaway that, yeah, you're welcome to leave or take. And I'm curious to hear what other people tangibly do too.
I just spoke a little bit earlier about scaffolding. So just to sort of break that down a little bit further, I realized that so many courses start out with a research paper, but don't really talk about the research process. So I've kind of backed off of those final papers and instead have students work on annotated bibliographies, which can be really tedious, but it really kind of introduces them to the process of, what is an academic article? How do you read an academic article? How do you assess the credibility of news sources that you're engaging with? How do you make sure that your research is including the voices of people who are impacted? And where do you find those voices when they're not in the mainstream media? So that's one thing I do in my classes that's concrete.
I guess a follow-up question I have to that is there, to what extent can we normalize non-cognitive supports in academic spaces? Like, what is the place of non-cognitive engagement, like social, emotional, relational, as part of a classroom space? And what might it mean for us to more intentionally incorporate that into our practice? I know many of you do that already. It's part of why I'm asking it, but there is sometimes a rub, I think, in academia about this idea of having, affective components to the work that we do, even though we are human beings. So it's a strange rub to me.
That's a great question, Rashi. I'm sorry to jump on the end, but yeah, that's been something I've been struggling with. Probably the biggest change I've made in the past few years as I teach some of this more technical computing and math stuff. And the biggest challenge with any of that is students thinking that they're not good at it or getting in their head or feeling down. So, I mean, that's much bigger struggle than students lacking the ability, because it's just, students can figure it out, but trying to convince themselves that they're not that these mistakes are normal has been a challenge. And I don't know how to, I think that maybe in this sort of computing community, I think that's becoming more of a thing, but I think it's quite important. And I don't know, I haven't ever seen strong institutional support for that. I don't even know what that would mean. I've tried to build, have a class or two on that, or just kind of bring it through as I talk about these issues, is to say, you might mess up, you might feel dumb. That's a normal feeling, and you're not, one of the people who go through it without, if you think people want to go through it without mistakes, they're lying or come from a place where they've had much more practice. And so I've tried to bring that out. I don't know if there's a way to do it systematically or institutionally, as you were suggesting, but I think it could make a huge difference.
I agree with you in terms of how so much academic self-efficacy goes into students feeling as though they have the ability to learn something, approaching a topic without heightened anxiety. So I teach advanced statistics too, which is the highest level of stats in our in our department. And I see that a lot in terms of limited self-efficacy. And what I do is remind the students that like they bring in things to learning as well across all areas, across all domains. So even in stats, even though they're not the counseling clinical students in which I serve as core faculty in that program, at the first week or the first day of each week, I do a brief check-in for all of them. They go around, they say their rose, thorn, bud for the week, just so we know what people are bringing in, what's stressing them out, how open are they to learning. So that's one thing, and also completing a self-assessment in some of my courses in which they examine, or self-reflection in which at midterm and finals, they examine what they feel like they're taking away from the course, what's hard for them, what are they bringing to the table. So that's a small way, and I definitely want to hear what others can do too, especially in larger courses.
Oh my goodness, I have the unenviable task of having to conclude this session where I feel like we've only just started to really go. And I am so sorry about that. The time melted away. Show me a thumbs up or give a hands up if you felt the time just absolutely melted away, because that's how rich the content has been so far. And so what I want to do, just make a couple of closing remarks here. First of all, to our amazing panelists, thank you, thank you, thank you. You are so amazing, and especially asking them to do something that can sometimes seem a little bit opaque, right? Because you're like, where did this conversation go? You know, get it started and do this. And so I just really want to say thank you for your grace, thank you for your kindness, thank you for your authenticity. And as Rashmi said, I like one of the words she talked about is coalition, right? You are an amazing coalition of partners, and it's this coalition. If we can get more of this coalition together, we're going to shake the timbers of this system to break it, to help these amazing young adults. So I want to just say again, thank you for sharing your insights with us today. And on behalf of the steering committee and to all the attendees, thank you for being able to participate. I want to give a special shout out to the amazing behind the scenes support. So thank you, Jessica, for keeping us going and online here with the technology. I want to give a very big shout out to Rashmi, who works very hard, and for your amazing advocacy and vision, and you are amazing, and so thank you. What will happen now is in the chat link, you are going to see a link to the next session. So make sure it's going to be a short closing session. And then we also encourage you to continue to please leverage the Jamboard. Again, the link will be in the chat thread. With that said, I thank you very much for attending, and we look forward to seeing you in the closing session. Panelists, if you can just hang back for 2 minutes, I would greatly appreciate it. So we will see you all in the closing session.